Thanks for joining us as we continue our series for Women's History Month. My guest on this episode is a longtime editor and was one of the first people who helped me to understand to have a healthy relationship with technology. Before we meet her, I do want to introduce two other people who are continuing to shape my relationship with tech. They are Jay Bloom and James Bilsbrough, hosts of the podcast Crossed Wires. Every week, Jay and James explore the intersection of tech and ethics with some amazing guests. As a filmmaker and a podcaster, I'm using tech all the time. I'm so glad to have found Crossed Wires. It puts a human face on technology. I'll put their trailer at the end of this episode. In the meantime, you can find Crossed Wires on crossedwires.net and on any podcasting app. Do you want to change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. I'm so grateful to be able to share the story of today's guest. Her story moves me and has made me think a lot about how, in general, secrets are not conducive to healing our oldest wounds. Sometimes things happen in our lives that hurt us deeply, and we find ourselves, for multiple reasons, unable to speak about it. If we're lucky, life goes on. Our resilience sees us through, and we eventually realize we're thriving, even though we still carry this deep wound. My guest today is longtime editor and now documentary filmmaker Vivien Hillgrove. For me to say that Vivien is cherished in the film community doesn't even come close to the love and admiration we all have for her. Like so many people, Vivien did have a deeply painful experience as a young woman. She's poured her heart into the art of filmmaking. Her connection with the characters and the stories she's been charged with telling as an editor is profound. It's up to Vivien to say, but I imagine that because she has experienced both deep pain and great joy, she's able to shape stories that portray the full range of emotions of a human life and respectfully give voice to the subjects and characters in these films. Only a few years ago, Vivien discovered that she was losing her sight to macular degeneration. Suddenly, this experience of losing one of the senses she relied on the most, both to tell stories and to maintain human connection, brought back feelings of loss and isolation from the deep wound she had carried throughout her life. These feelings were all too familiar, taking her back in time to when she was forced to give up her daughter for adoption in secrecy as a young teenager. Vivien was asked to carry so much shame as just a young girl, really. She has realized that it's time to finally say no more secrets and make a documentary herself in order to share both the story of losing her daughter and what she calls the adventure of losing her sight, in the hopes that it would help others with similar experiences. Through it all, she takes us on the wonderful journey she's had in the film industry. The working title for her new documentary is Vivien's Wild Ride, which is really the best that any of us could hope to call a life of courage and resilience. Vivien Hillgrove has been working as an editor and sound editor for over 50 years. I think back to when I first began working in post-production sound in the Bay Area. Even before I worked on a film with Vivien, I knew who she was. She was that warm smile and laugh that made you feel welcome. When I did finally work on the crew of a film that Vivien was editing, I remember how the energy changed when she and her then partner and now wife, Karen Bracco, would arrive in the editing suites. There was always that great combination of fun and seriously good work. At a certain point, Vivien turned to editing independent documentaries, and that partnership in crafting compelling, ethical stories with some of the most amazing nonfiction filmmakers working today was possibly a crucial step in leading her to make her first documentary film in her 70s. For me, Vivien telling her story of losing her sight and its connection to an earlier time of tremendous loss and pain is such an act of generosity. How many others might be healed by hearing her story? How might it lead us all to set aside our own secrets that have cost us so much by keeping them? Hi, Viv. Thank you so much for being on Art Heals All Wounds.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, can you start by telling us who you are, just your name and what you do?
Great. And thank you so much, Pam, for inviting me on. It's really special. My name is Vivien Hillgrove, and I have been an editor, a picture editor, and sound editor for about 50 years in both feature films and documentaries. My last incarnation is 20 years of documentaries. And now I've taken my first dip into the deep waters of directing a documentary at the age of 76. So it's pretty exciting and really terrifying at the same time.
Well, it's interesting because, you just gave a little bit of an overview of your career, but you really are, I want to say legend, but that's kind of dehumanizing, which is not you at all. But you've had this amazing spectrum of work where you have worked on some of the most iconic, large theatrical feature films. And now you have been working with some really impactful documentary directors, and then just aside from that amazing career, your personal life is really inspiring. You have this amazing relationship, long-term, loving relationship you've been in, and you and Karen have created this little corner of paradise where you live. There's so much about your life to really celebrate, but I know that at some point in the recent past, you got a big surprise that really affects your work in film.
I started the film because I got a diagnosis of macular degeneration, which is an age-related disease, but it also is hereditary, which my mother had it. And I wished I had known as much as I do now about the particular disease and its manifestations visually. So I thought, I'm losing my sight. I was writing what was to become a book about my experience in high school getting pregnant and then being sent to the home for unwed mothers and relinquishing my daughter. So the blindness, the encroaching loss of sight, sent me back to exactly the feeling and the presence that I felt when I was a young girl going to the home of being isolated, invisible, and not heard. So that came rushing back. It was just slammed me back into this place that I thought I had sort of healed from and had reconciled with, but it just came back in spades. So I thought, well, what do I know how to do? 45 years of film at that particular point, and I know film the best. I know how to tell a film because of editing, being an editor. And I thought, well, even if I'm losing my sight, I at least kind of like almost can intuitively know how to put this thing together about this story, about these two forms of isolation or loss, and be able to integrate the two of them better than in language, but in pictures and metaphor, allegory, and those kinds of vehicles to help me tell the story. First of all, so that people know about what it's like to slowly go through macular degeneration over the period of the film,
Mhm.
from what was average to advanced
Mm.
macular degeneration, and also to hopefully have no other girls ever have to go through what I did in terms of growing up in a time of what we call really the 50s mindset of
Mhm.
no contraceptions, no birth controls, no sex education at home, pre-Roe v. Wade, and also DNA, which DNA really wasn't advanced that much to really prove the paternity of a young boy, of the father.
Mm.
So girls were sort of relegated to, no, she slept with everyone and she's a slut and could easily be shamed without that proof of paternity. Things, of course, changed much later. But as I see politics kind of shifting to a more conservative kind of mindset, I thought, oh, we cannot go backwards. It is too painful. It affects you your whole life. And so I began the journey of telling not one, not two, but three stories: the story of film, the story of young girls getting pregnant, unwed, and the story of how blindness is not just biological. Blindness is also a not understanding the time that we live in and what the mores, how they are affecting people. So it seemed eminently important to me to get that out now. First of all, I'm 76, but I didn't want to lose all my sight by the time the film ended, so, and then what tricks and things I learned along the way and tools to help me see, to help me really enter that world of vision again, not to see what is really there, but to see what is in my imagination and be able to translate that to the screen. And I found out all these extraordinary ways of, kind of imagining something, creating the words for it, and then swapping out those words for what was in my mind and having a really, really fantastic editor help me put that together. So it was an extraordinary challenge. So the process of losing sight became exciting. I mean, it sounds crazy to say that, but it's like, oh, I'm losing my sight, and I got this really great idea for a scene, but that is life, the ability to hold both the sadness and the joy in your hands at the same time. So creativity is really sort of favors that joy side, although many times is started by sadness.
Mm.
So that journey of finding out of, like a detective story, finding out what could I use to keep creative while I'm losing my sight, while I'm working on this film, and how do I take the audience back into the context of the time, which most people do not understand, the 50s at all,
Right.
and what kind of pressure and mindset you would have to do the most unconscionable event, which is to relinquish your child.
Mm.
So that became a mission for me, to just help prevent that from happening again, and to help all of the things I learned about sight along my adventure, so that other people who have macular, older people, younger people who have sight loss that has an element of hallucination as part of it, to
Wow.
feel okay about, it's unbelievable what are the manifestations and the symptoms of macular degeneration. And maybe I'll just start out with one that blew my mind.
Okay, I'd like to hear that.
It's amazing. So when you're losing your sight, at least into macular, there's various stages. All, both autism, blindness, all of that is on a spectrum.
Mhm.
You don't go from sighted to not sighted. Very few people are totally, totally blind. People are variations of how they see. And you can be legally blind and not just see black, of course. So going through all these particular events with blindness or decreasing sight, I realized that a couple things happened. One was that my interior visual landscape increased fantastically.
Wow.
My sense of touch increased dramatically, which is a little dangerous, especially during the pandemic. It's like, oh, I'd love to feel the skin on your face. Forget it. It's like, and so I think it must aid Braille in some
Mm,
fashion as well. So I had all these textures. And so what were some of my first kinds of imagery was somewhat erotic, if I may say that, which I thought, wow, this is an interesting development. And the other thing is that you are talking to people, and for me the first thing that I started to see was a Picasso face. I'm holding my hands together now that are
right.
not parallel. And so the Picasso face was so disarming to me because of the parallax between our eyes. We're seeing, each eye sees something different, right? So a Picasso face. And then I couldn't, these were my friends, my family, and everything. So I would look away, and then they would look away. And then I lost them. And so there was this feeling of me being a part of losing people. I
Mm,
Vision was so important to me in film. Everything on the screen was important to me. And then all of a sudden to lose this, I would look people directly in the eye and talk to them. And, I'd feel something from them so that we could keep the ball rolling back and forth between us, because repartee conversation was so important, and the
right.
people that I love. And so all of a sudden they kind of pulled away from me based on me doing it first. So then I thought, okay. And then all of a sudden that Picasso face, because it was degenerating, became a blank face. And that was almost easier for me in some way, except that you are stopped in your tracks, wondering what that person's expression is. And then another form of communication I was missing, which was this knowing what they were looking at, how they were looking at me, how, was there a glint in their eye or a kind of a downturned mouth? And I couldn't tell. And I was so used to bouncing off people based on their expression.
Mm,
And it's just such a subtle thing until it's gone.
right.
But then it advanced to the point of just taking a breath and looking away, because macular, you have peripheral vision, but no center vision. Now, there's no way you have a big black hole in the way. Your brain says, forget that. We are going to invent the middle.
Ah,
So I would look at the side, kind of see their eye, and then kind of put the eye over the face and then talk to them, because at least I had an eye to look at.
wow.
And then I thought, okay, I can do this. I previously was in a panic, as if I was smothering. And so that happened. Then I knew I could figure out a way to feel connected to someone, because everything for me was the eyes. So that advanced a little bit further. And then all of a sudden I was doing dishes one day after really, I've tried to see the entire time that I've been making this film, really search to see with putting, rocking things in front of me back and forth so that my peripheral vision will have a concept of what could be in the middle, and then creating that middle in my mind. And so one day I'm doing dishes and I look out the window and I see this man in a tree. And I'm going, holy shit, it looks like a real man. I'm a child of the 60s. I dropped acid in the 60s. I know the difference between a hallucination and a real person, right? A lot of us do, my age. And so I'm looking at this guy in the tree and I'm saying, that is in focus. Everything about his face and hair is in focus, which I would never see him outside the window. And he reminds me of Mark Twain in a funny kind of weird. Why the hell would I see Mark Twain? I mean, it just made no sense. And so I was surprised and astonished, but I knew my eyesight at that point was creating things. So I thought, well, I wonder if it's my eyesight or maybe I'm losing my mind over all this stuff. So it happened to my therapist at Earlbaum Center for the Blind said, I talked to her next day on the phone and she said, oh, you have Charles Bonnet syndrome. And I went, like it's a good thing, like it's something really to relish. And it ended up being a really good thing, because about 39% of the population that has severe sight loss sees what they call the Charles Bonnet syndrome. And I had never heard of it. Nobody, even up until working with eye specialists for 4 or 5 years at that point, 5 years easy, told me about this thing. And the Charles Bonnet syndrome is this, 39% of the people seeing either a person from history with historic costume on, that kind of thing, an animal, or a child. A lot of them see that. But almost all of them never say a word about it because they're terrified of being accused of having Alzheimer's or being psychotic. So
Wow.
that became one of the most important things for me, is this sense of when older people are losing their sight, of keeping secrets.
Mm.
Keeping secrets so that they do not get misjudged, misclassified, misdiagnosed as to what is really going on for them. And I think of all the people in history who had, macular, and who had this severe kind of eye disease, inventing these characters and them just throwing them in the funny house, right? Just
Right.
saying they are insane, you can't possibly see this, you must be psychotic, or a writer of children's books, I kept thinking. Like, wait a minute, let's reread Alice. So I was arrogant enough to think it was the eye disease and not my brain going, wackadoodle. But I could understand the desire completely to keep it secret. But so much of the film is about not keeping secrets and being truthful where you are. Now, it depends. Like, if you live in a culture that accepts and listens to things, that's a very different thing. I can completely understand why people kept it secret 20, 50 years ago,
Right.
because it really wasn't it was diagnosed but not allowed into the realm of psychiatry until like the 1980s. So that's an awful lot of people, because there's millions of us who have macular. So that kind of is then the final, not the final stage, but my main motivation for describing this descent into a lack of sight, but also the ascent into creativity and these wild things that you get to see. Yeah. So I thought, okay, let's do a blue screen of this guy in a tree, because I have to show what it really looks like. So I found a friend of mine, Gary Weinberg, who was so kind. I said, would you be like a Mark Twain for a second, a guy in a tree? Because I'm envisioning it. He said, oh, sure, I can do that. So we did a blue screen of it. And he said, I got so interested in Mark Twain all of a sudden for playing him, as a guy standing in a tree, that he said, I started rereading him again. And he said, it's his books were the most anti-racist books I've ever read. And I thought, oh, that is so interesting. There is such a remarkable thing that happens when you tell the truth, and that you create something creative into that truth, even though you're afraid of it. And then that results in someone else having an awareness of something. And those threads, those little detective story, chicken, feed dropping, this kind of thing is what really makes this whole art film thing hold together, is these things that lead from one person to another person to this. So that is basically the blind arc. But the beginning of it was the story that I was writing, which begins with my father, I was so in love with my father because he was just a gentle, really nice person, was really a good guy. So he worked in a job he hated for 40 years because just to raise us 5 kids, because we weren't even middle class by any stretch of the imagination. So he would come home from his job every day that he hated, and then us kids would be just standing around. He would go up to the piano and start playing the piano, and the whole house came alive. Wow. He came alive from being beaten down by this job that he hated. And what that did was teach me as a child what is healing.
That's amazing.
What changes this household into kids running around and now screaming, and I would dance, and we were all making noise, and my mother loved it, and he was playing boogie woogie. And so I thought, oh my God, remember this, remember this. And so I pursued art in high school. But being a somewhat precocious child in high school, I got pregnant. And
Do you mind me asking, how old were you?
I was 17 when I got pregnant and 18 when I delivered.
Okay.
To be quite blunt, it was a one night stand basically with an older 21-year-old boy.
Wow.
I was with once. And then all hell broke loose. And at that particular time, a lot of young women were, with their steadies, with their boyfriends, were having sex. Nobody talked about it ever, even I didn't with even my best friend. But woe be you if you got caught or got pregnant. That seemed to be the big sin, is that you actually got pregnant. So then I was diagnosed, that I was pregnant. I was 4 months along before I realized it, which is shocking because I have an IQ over room temperature. And so, it's like I look back now, I can't understand it. So then my father took me to my grandmother's so that I could be hidden. And my grandmother thought it really was a good idea for me never to tell anybody. And so did the doctor. And so from her house, I would spend days in a really dark room in San Francisco with very little light. And that was for about 2 or 3 months. And I was by myself every day while my grandma went to work. And then somebody, thank God, finally said, I guess, because nobody ever asked me anything or told me anything about what was going to be happening or going on. And one day they said, grab your suitcase. And I went to the home for unwed mothers, which thank God I wasn't alone anymore. And thank God there were other girls there like me.
Right.
And I've heard a lot of women poo-pooing the Salvation Army and the Home for Unwed Mothers. But for me, it was different. For me, it was being able to be around people like me and not being alone and not being isolated anymore. It was huge, huge to me.
Right.
And then there, out of the blue, it was a miracle, really. There was this woman I met who was from England, and she said, I'm a pianist. And I went, wow. And we would sneak out and go to the rec room, and she would play this amazing classical music and some jazz. And I would sit there in my rocking chair, and I would just be back home. So then they told us if we were feeling contractions, to go up to the 3rd floor and knock on the door. They didn't need to tell us what a contraction was. You knew it just when it happened, because we weren't told about what would happen or what was going to go on. And so I went upstairs, knocked on the door, and then I said, I think I'm having a baby. And then I got on a gurney, I think. I have a lot of amnesia about that place and what happened. I'm not sure of anything, but I remember that there were these lights that I was looking at that were beautiful. And, it's crazy that in the middle of all of this, I didn't feel any pain. And I just saw these lights and it was beautiful. And then I saw a hand and I grabbed the hand really quickly and I held on to it so tight. And then I remember this whoosh, everything falling out of me. And then I blacked out.
Yeah.
I either fainted or I don't know what happened. I don't remember hearing my child cry or anything. I just passed out. They said I had hemorrhage, but I don't know. I heard so many things that turned out to be not true when I investigated. So I think it was the next morning, I'm not quite sure, one of the matrons came over and said, you have to see your child. And so I went, and through a glass window, this other young girl who was pregnant held up my child, and it was as if a silver string went from my heart to her heart. But I was told that if I didn't relinquish her, I would shame my family and my brothers and sisters all the way through high school.
Right.
So I walked out of that place. My father picked me up, and then they never mentioned it again. And I kept the secret for 23 years because they said, do not try to find her until she is at least 21. And so I thought, oh, that's really good advice. I wouldn't want to hurt her growing up.
Right.
So nobody knew. My brothers and sisters had no idea.
Oh, Viv.
And so I would just, stay in my room and cry, into a pillow just so they wouldn't hear. I didn't want to upset them. And then a most wonderful thing happened. Somebody recommended that I go to this. I needed a job, and they recommended that I would go to this place called Studio 16. And I went there, and he goes, the owner of the place says, well, what do you know about film? And I said, I don't know anything about film, but I will work harder than anyone you've ever met.
Right.
And I got the job. I was like astonished. And this older man who was the sweetest person, looked a little bit like Mark Twain, taught me everything. Him and I just ran this studio, and he taught me how to run the camera. And this is all analog days, right? So it's like Bolexes and Cine Specials. And he taught me how to mix, granted 6 pots instead of 600 pots. And I learned how to mix on the fly. And then I got to shoot both stills and motion pictures. And then I negative cut, and then I edited. And that was it. That was where I could be alone and kind of be by myself, but in this wonderful studio, this magical place of equipment. And I could figure out each one of them. Something was easy for me. This mechanical world was really easy. I used to build things when I was a kid all the time. And I loved the tools of it. The tools were so stable, and heavy. They were grounded, and I wasn't. And I just started to drop into this world of mechanical things.
Right.
And I loved it. And it was like my first venture into finding the tools of art to be able to help my sadness.
Yeah.
And then I worked on the stupidest things you've ever heard. Like Denver's place, Studio 16, was so marvelous because we did industrial films, and I got to work on things like the product picker packer, how to wrap toilet paper. This big machine from Crown Zellenbach of how to wrap toilet paper. And there was something so sweet, so simple, so easy that it was just funny. And we did films for Wells Fargo, and we made the section of, I should never admit this, the part where the guys came up on horses and stole money from Wells Fargo. I'm like, yeah, that's the best part. And so we did a couple of clandestine things, but he was so much fun to be around, and he knew all about music. And he said this blatant kind of funny thing that people who are filmmakers would just like be astonished. He said, Vivien, if you want to be a good editor, cut everything to Sibelius. And I went, I have a feeling that's not entirely correct.
Cut everything to what?
Sibelius, the composer. Sibelius is the guy who was Salieri in Amadeus. He was the guy, the opposite, F. Murray Abraham, next to Tom Hulce, who was
of course.
Mozart.
Yes.
Mozart. So that's Sibelius. So then I thought, okay, cut everything to music. And I thought, well, happiness is created by music, and maybe that's a good idea. And then I developed this philosophy that music is the highest art form and is math as well. So I started getting interested in like just the mathematical component of music and stuff. But so it jetted me into being able to cut music for films in terms of documentaries and also industrials. But anyway, long story short, it turns out then we kind of evolved into doing 35 millimeter, and I was looking around for editing rooms, and there was American Zoetrope, Coppola's wonderful venture. So I actually rented rooms there to work on this, low budget family entertainment GP that we did. And I was next to, but not part of, all these amazing filmmakers. Phil Kaufman was working on White Dawn. Coppola's working on The Conversation. And Nick Ray, who was crazier than a hoot owl, was working in the last room. And we had this fantastic editing room. And I got used to being around all these kinds of people who were just legendary. I mean, really legendary. And we're working on this dorky little film. And so anyway, later I got a job in feature films on some big films. And I always felt like so advantaged that I had come up from a very humble kind of, industrial studio. I hadn't gone to college. I never actually went to college other than the JC. Mm-hmm. And I was around these, legendary people. So I always kind of felt like I got in through the back door and got a chance to meet all these people. Right. So then I did get a chance to work with Phil Kaufman, who was a wonderful, wonderful person to work with, and always was a champion of helping me and inviting me to work on his other jobs. So I started in sound and then moved to picture editing with Unbearable Lightness of Being and Henry right. and June.
Yes.
Anyway, so on Unbearable Lightness of Being, my most wonderful partner, Karen, says, "You've been suffering all these years." And I decided that I would try to find my daughter. And she was 22 at that particular point. And Karen said, "You can't do it alone. I need to help you do it." Aww. And so she was most responsible for finding my daughter. It's if anybody wants to know an illegal way to do it, I can tell them. I'm not going to put it on this show. But she was able to find her and then find her picture, her graduation picture. And so she brought the photo into Unbearable Lightness Being, where I was editing, and she put the photo in front of me, and I just went, oh. And everybody came running in the room, and they said, "What happened? What happened?" I said, "No, this is really good. This is my daughter." So I found her. We found her. And then she's 58 now. Mm. And when we first met, she was 23, and we were two strangers coming together. And we had easy times and difficult times. And now we're going through an honest time where instead of being polite and somewhat separated from each other by politeness and the worry that each of us would somehow hurt the other or I was so shamed. Right. That I thought, I have to be so careful. What I should have been is just myself. Because two people can feel each other's nervousness. Yeah. And so we admitted that. And now we're working on being whatever the new definition is. Mother isn't right. Daughter feels right. I tried my family name of Bunny, but then it made me feel like I was 6 and she was 46. So it didn't work really well. It's a diminutive name for me. And because of film and because of, my eyesight going and all of that, all of this is really an extraordinary ending to an amazing, amazing story of being embraced by the film industry, not caring if I was gay, not caring afterwards that I had had a child, where before all of that was so hidden. Right. So through film, I found a community and a family. Through my dearest darling, Karen, I found my daughter. Yeah. So that's why I had to tell this story, because for so many years, 23 years, I had hidden it, because so shamed, and then found what I would say some worth in the film industry in being able to do this craft, which then turned into an art. Yes. So at one point, with feature films, I thought, I have to change things. I really need to give back to the community, to people. And I started meeting like Lourdes Portillo, who I worked with for 30 years, almost 30 years now, and on 8 films for her. And her stories are mainly about loss. Yeah. And it was something I was familiar with. So it transformed into us having one of the most remarkable director-editor relationships ever. So I was editor for her for that length of time, and then met Deanne Bourget-Leem, who was another most amazing woman filmmaker, that then I got to work on her film about adoption.
Mm.
And she is adopted, and as you know, I'm a birth mother. And working on that film, I had the synergy that was so dynamic. I got to learn more about adopted children, and it was like seeing a little bit of my daughter, Kathleen,
Mm.
and getting to know her from, even though I had met her at that particular point, our lives were very different. She started having children, which I was so happy she was creating her world in this most beautiful way.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to see through Deanne what her history was, being adopted. So I am the luckiest person in the world to have had those opportunities, to have had the sadness in many ways, to have had the blindness in many ways, to just give me an insight, some language, some understanding of human sadness, of loss, of separation, and those kinds of feelings, which I bring now to my art, to my film. I just hope people like it and learn something from it.
I have no doubt that that will be the case. Okay, I'm feeling a lot of emotion, so I'm trying to pull my thoughts together here. I guess just a practical question. You recently had some really great big news about this film. And so I just, about the ITVS partnership. And so I wanted to ask you where you are with the film and, what kind of boost you're getting now that you have this sort of, for people who don't know what ITVS is, it's a organization that helps get documentaries to public television, essentially, just as a
Right.
abbreviated way of saying it.
I had applied for 3 times and didn't get it. But I love the people at ITVS. I mean, what they do in terms of PBS and getting documentaries on TV is extraordinary. And then the 4th time I thought, let me try one more time. And I got it. And it was just like, whoa, just persevere. That's all I can say. Persevere. No matter what it is, persevere. And it means that we will be on TV, which is astounding to me. I'm just so excited about that. People get to see this film almost more than streaming on TV, where people, millions, will possibly see it. I'm very honored. And where I am is in about 67% done.
Wow.
To be specific. It gives me some wiggle room there. And we have shot, I'd say, about that much of the principal photography of it. A lot of editing has already been done. During the pandemic, we could only do editing, me and my editor, because we didn't want to risk anybody's health by shooting other people during the pandemic. But anyway, so where we are is, I would say, easily 2/3 of the way through. It has taken 3.5 years, 4 years to get to this point. The average, I had heard the other day, the average length of time it takes for a documentary to get done is 7 years.
Yeah.
So when people say, it's been like a year or two, Viv, where the hell is the film? I'll go, it takes a long time to get grants. That many times the grants that help move you along, you apply 1 month, and 6 to 8 months later, you get the money.
Right.
So that is a long waiting time. So ITVS has been fantastic. I mean, they've just been there. We have creative control of it. They're like super, super duper producers. My producer here at home is Deanne Bourget-Leem, which is, of course, such a pleasure, and she's so brilliant, and I'm happy to be working with her so much. She's the right person for this film.
Right.
And so we're expecting, hopefully, to be done with the rough cut, possibly fine cut by September, October of this year. So that is huge. That is huge. I'm scared out of my wits.
Oh.
The film is kind of experimental in some ways. Many of the visuals are how I see what it looks like to me, the blank faces, the Picasso face, these kinds of things, just so people can get an idea when they're talking to someone who is low-sighted, what may be going on in their brain.
Right.
Because visually they're seeing something nobody else in the room is seeing,
Right.
so it's very important for me. And also how long it took for me to find Kathleen. So now the film gets to say the truth. Everybody comes out of their hiding, and that is really important and really brave of my daughter who is in the film, and really, really terrifying for me. But you just got to go there to be yourself and be honest. I'm a flawed character in this film, really a flawed character, and that's good. That's the truth.
Thank you for doing that, and thank you for sharing that. And it's just been delightful to talk with you and to hear this story. And thank you for making time. I know it's so much work to make a film, and the fact that you made time to come and tell me about it really means a lot.
Oh, Pam, I just thank you so much for doing this really important work. It's so important. So thank you from the bottom of my heart.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you to Vivien Hillgrove for sharing her story on the show today. I was so deeply into it that I forgot to ask her where you can find out more about her. But you can find information about Vivien's Wild Ride on Facebook or just by Googling that title. You'll also find more about Vivien's career by Googling Vivien Hillgrove. Thank you for listening to this story today. It means so much to me that you care about the work that artists are doing to create change in both our hearts and in our communities. Following Art Heals All Wounds on your favorite listening app really helps me reach you with the stories of more amazing artists. And remember, you can always reach me through my website, arthealsallwoundspodcast.com. The music you've heard in this podcast is by Ketsa and Lobo Loco. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. As always, this show was recorded using Squadcast FM. Art Heals All Wounds comes to you from Oakland, California, on unceded territory of the Choqueño Ohlone people.
Do you have an interest in technology, but struggle with some of its less than ethical parts? Well, we've got the show for you.
I'm Jay.
And I'm James, and together, we're the team behind Crosswires. Every week, we bring you a new episode focusing on a specific tech-related topic with a guest or guests who really know their stuff in that field.
We've covered things like backing up your data, how art and technology can be used together. We've taken deep dives into Linux. We've explored some cool hardware like the Valve Steam Deck.
And if you're a bit nostalgic for the tech of your youth, we've got you covered with episodes focusing on retro computing like the Amiga, the Atari ST, and even good old-fashioned computing magazines from the 90s.
Our chats are always relaxed, and we truly hope you'll find an episode you love. And maybe you'll even learn something new from our discussions. You can find our episodes over at crossedwires.net.
And of course, we're in all the really good podcast apps and many of the really bad ones too. We hope you'll enjoy the show, and thanks for listening.